Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This episode is titled The Truth About the Unconscious Mind. I'm going to be delving into some popular myths prevalent in the NLP and hypnosis world about the unconscious mind and some truths discovered by cognitive science about the unconscious mind. Some of these findings will likely surprise you. I have to admit, I've been wrong. I used to believe exactly the notions that I'm about to debunk and criticize here. So let me start off by offering an analogy, and we'll get into some practical applications from there. So imagine that you're sitting in a restaurant. You haven't ordered anything. You're just sitting there with your cup of coffee or beer, perhaps. And you're watching waiters with trays coming out of the kitchen, serving a lasagna over there, a pizza over there, a steak with French fries. Someone's getting ice cream. Someone's getting chocolate cake. What you're seeing is the end result of a bunch of processes that you can't see and have zero access to. Meaning, what you see as the end result is the pizza coming out of the kitchen, right? That's the end result. But you have zero access to the kitchen. You have zero access to what's going on in the kitchen. Not only do you have zero access to the processes taking place in the kitchen, you have no access to the activity at the farms which produce the various materials that the chefs utilize for making the foods. You have no access to the drivers who transport these things, nor do you have any access to the stockholders in the chain of restaurants that might be making the decisions about what gets served and how it gets served in that particular restaurant. This is all completely invisible to you. All you see is the end product. There's this notion in NLP, for example, that we can have introspective access to our unconscious strategies, our unconscious mental strategies. Cognitive psychologists used to believe that we have introspective access to our mental processes. Hypnotists very often sell the notion that you can directly get in touch with or receive privileged information from the unconscious. All of this is a myth. These days, through cognitive science, it's pretty clear that we humans actually don't have any access whatsoever to our mental processes. We have zero access to it. We could use perception as an example. So for example, if you open your eyes and you just look, a world appears, apparently with shapes and colors and forms and all sorts of stuff. That's a bit like the lasagna that comes out of the kitchen. The world that you see is the end result of a bunch of processes that are completely invisible and that you have zero access to. So in neuroscience and cognitive science today, for example, there's consensus that there's no colors, for example, in the world. There are no sounds in the world. The colors actually get generated by our own neurology. The sounds are actually generated by the brain. Sure, there are changes in ear pressure waves hitting the inner ear, but the brain actually produces a sound. The brain actually produces the colors that we think we see in the external world. the color red or the sound of the chainsaw just appears to you. You have zero access to the processes that gives rise to those particular perceptions. Hypnosis or meditation doesn't change that at all. It doesn't make those processes any more visible. So it's not that strange, really, if you can consider that the perceptions that you see of the world just emerge, and you have zero access to the kitchen, you have zero access to what happens at the farms or at the stock meetings or whatever. You can also see that, for example, a particular memory construct may appear in awareness, but you have no access to the processes in which that happens. Same goes with what we call cognition or thinking. A particular insight or a particular idea might emerge, but once again, we don't really have any access to the processes that those cognitions emerge out of. So us NLPers who talked about strategies for so long, we're just wrong. You know, cognitive psychologists have been wrong as well. So if we don't really have access to, if we don't really have any introspective access to our mental processes whatsoever, what does that mean? Well, consider this. We can have access to some of the behavioral and cognitive output. We may be aware of certain thoughts after the fact. We may be aware of how we're behaving or what's going on. So we might have a correct theory or a more or less correct theory about the rules we applied in a particular context. And that might be true. So Richard Nisbett, who's a social psychologist, who's done a lot of interesting research around this, he uses the example of mathematics, where, for example, you might know the rules of mathematics and be able to kind of infer or check the outcome with the particular rules that you've used. That's one thing, but you don't really have any access to the process of multiplication. So back to Richard Nisbett, he's done some very interesting research around this, which shows that the reasons we come up with for why we do what we do is very often flat out wrong. Like we're just making it up, and often have very little access to what actually might be going on. So in some of my favorite writings on this topic, he started to study, he got very curious about cultures of honor. Like, why is it over twice as many homicides in the United States South and Southwest, for example, in honor cultures, as there is in similar socioeconomic conditions in the northern United States? More than twice the homicide rate. And it's more than twice the homicide rate among non-Hispanic white males. And it all comes down to insults. So if you stay out of the wrong bars or the wrong bedrooms, you're as safe in the South as you are in the North. So he did this very interesting experiment at the University of Michigan, where he took students he knew was from the South or who had a southern background, and students who he knew had a northern background. And he did. I mean, social psychologists always have this. Um, they always have these bogus fronts for the research that they do. So they involved these participants in an experiment where they had to fill out some forms, pass someone in the hallway, and then come back. And I can't quite remember what the party line or what the intention behind the experiment was. But as they're walking down the hallway, there's this photo lab, and there's this guy who's out there working on a filing cabinet. And that person has to shut a drawer for the student to be able to pass. And then when the student comes right back again after a few seconds, and he has to, close the drawer again, he bumps into the student and says asshole, and then quickly goes into the photo lab. And the question is, would the Southerners and the Northerners respond differently to such an insult? And according to witnesses who were observing it, there were very marked differences. The Northerners tended to have responses such as like amusement or like, what's up with him? Like, what was that all about? The Southerners tended to have more like a rage response, like a what the fuck, like more of an insult response. And what they also did was that they tested people's saliva, took tests to measure production of testosterone and cortisol before and after the insult. The Northerners had no increase of cortisol and testosterone. The Southerners did quite extensively. Here's the very interesting thing to look at, and that is if you look at the United States South, a lot of Scottish Irish people who were herders, essentially, compared to the northern United States, where you had more of the English and the German and the Dutch, who were predominantly farmers. If you lived as a herder and someone stole your pig, you could be poor overnight. So living as a herder, you needed to be able to set boundaries, to be able to show some teeth, and to show people that you're not to be messed with. Versus in the farming world, those qualities are less needed, so to speak. So it seems as if people whose ancestors come from a herding background are way more likely to respond strongly to perceived insults than people whose ancestors have more of a farming background. And it also shows that, like, the students in recent years in Michigan, are not getting ready to become herders. They're getting ready to become bankers or whatever it might be. But a particular culture can long survive the conditions in which they were created. So the point being that you could do meditation or hypnosis all day long. You'd never be able to discover these sorts of things and how they might be relevant to how you respond to something. So, for example, when I work with people for anger issues, we can't really access their unconscious processing. It's a bit like what comes out of the kitchen. The person might just have the conscious experience of a surge of anger and hearing what they perceive to be an insult and wanting to put the person in their place. But what we can do is we can kind of infer, like if you know that anger is essentially about rule violation, for example, you can kind of infer, well, what rule must I have had on behalf of the other person to feel so violated, for example? Well, I might be demanding that no one throw an insult, or I might be demanding that someone has to respect me, for example. And I might be evaluating the person as a prick for saying those things. So by becoming aware of that and questioning it and exploring it, the next time the client goes into a similar circumstance, they can have a very different experience, because the theory regarding what rules or premises that kind of lie behind their emotional state were largely correct. So you can influence your unconscious processing by challenging your rules, challenging your premises, setting different intents, offering suggestions, for example. So just the other day, I helped a woman glue her feet hypnotically to the floor. I had her imagine that her feet were stuck to the floor and that this was just happening all by itself. And it became very real to her. And she had the experience that the more she tried to lift her feet, the more they were stuck to the ground. So in this case, you could say that we influenced her unconscious processing, even though we had no direct access to them. And the way she described it was that, I was completely awake, but it was as if the signals I tried to send from my brain to my feet just didn't work. Like there was a lag there somehow. So he has Nisbett has another really interesting. I'm going to read from his new book Thinking here. He also has a very good book called Mindware, which I highly recommend. There's also one called The Geography of Thought, which goes into how Easterners and Westerners have a tendency to conceptualize very, very differently. All very great books that I've enjoyed and benefited a lot from. So here's a student of Nisbett who sent a letter purporting to be an inquiry about employment possibilities to 1,000 businesses in the North and South. And the writer's credentials indicated he was qualified for a low-level managerial post. Toward the end of the letter, he wrote the following. So I'm quoting this from Nisbett's autobiography. There is one thing I must explain, because I feel I must be honest and want no misunderstandings. I have been convicted of a felony, namely manslaughter. I got into a fight with someone who was having an affair with my fiancée. I lived in a small town, and one night this person confronted me in front of my friends at the bar. He told everyone that he and my fiancée were sleeping together. He laughed at me to my face and asked me to step outside if I was man enough. I was young and didn't want to back down from a challenge in front of everyone. As we went into the alleyway, he started to attack me. He knocked me down and picked up a bottle. I could have run away, and the judge said I should have, but my pride wouldn't let me. Instead, I picked up a pipe that was laying in the alley and hit him with it. I didn't mean to kill him, but he died a few hours later at the hospital. So some business owners sent the letter writer a job application or offered the name of a contact person to call. Some even sent a note. The southern businesses owners were much more likely to respond in this way than the northern ones, and the southern notes were more sympathetic. One southern woman wrote the following: "As for your problem of the past, anyone could probably be in the situation you were in. It was just an unfortunate incident that shouldn't be held against you. Your honesty shows that you are sincere. I wish you the best of luck for your future. You have a positive outlook and a willingness to work. If you're near here, please stop in and see us." So no letter from the Northerners were remotely as sympathetic. So in terms of change work, for example, what you might be able to do with someone is you might be able to infer or kind of lurk out what premises, what rules, what rule violations that the client might be operating out of when they feel their anger. You might help the client become aware of that, challenge that, modify that, and then the client may find that they have a very different response when they re-enter those sorts of contexts. But what you, of course, will never discover are the sort of links just described here with the Nisbett experiments. For example, that perhaps one of the key factors in whether you respond that way to an insult or not is perhaps that your ancestors were herders versus farmers, for example. If you look at instrumental, not honor violence, but if you look at instrumental violence, there's a very interesting criminologist by the name of Adrian Raine who has a tendency to lean heavily towards the biological roots of crime. It's an interesting book to read, especially for those of us who have a NLP or hypnosis background where we have a tendency to have a more constructivist view of the world. So it's interesting to read stuff like that for balance. His book is called The Anatomy of Violence, and he's been involved in a lot of research around who uses instrumental aggression, like antisocial violence to get what they want. And out of 48, risk factors that seem kind of interdependent, they were able to find 2 risk factors that seem to be somewhat independent of the others, where one was way more strongly correlated with antisocial violence, instrumental violence, than any of the others. They were poor concentration skills, which came in second, and the one that had the tightest correlation was a low resting heart rate. Not poverty, not low IQ, not lack of education, low resting heart rates. And one way they discovered this was that they took a bunch of kids in several experiments. You can read about this in The Anatomy of Violence, and tested their heart rates from like the age of 3 or 4, over decades, and noticed that there was something particularly cold-blooded about the people who tended to have low resting heart rates that made them way more likely to engage in the cognitions and the emotions and the behaviors associated with antisocial violence. Now, you may protest, as I did too, and say, look, I know plenty of people who have low resting heart rates who are not violent. For example, my father is not a violent man. He has a very low resting heart rate. One of my best friends has a very low resting heart rate. He's a vegan. He wouldn't hurt a fly. You can do that in the same way that you can say that a lot of people who smoke who don't have lung cancer. Most of the people, the vast majority of people who smoke never develop lung cancer. But smoking has a pretty strong correlation with lung cancer. And the correlation between low resting heart rate and instrumental violence is, I think, 2.5 to 3 times higher than the correlation between smoking and lung cancer. So once again, what is it about that somehow contributes to those sorts of behaviors in the world? These are things that we can't really access through introspection or through meditation or through hypnosis or through NLP patterning or anything like that remotely. So the the idea too the other myth, in addition to that we can't directly access our mental processing, is this idea that there's an entity like thing in there called the unconscious mind that we can communicate with and get direct answers to, right? This is also a myth. There is no such thing as an unconscious mind. It's not like a genie in a box. There's no thing like entity that can give you the answer, about where something comes from or why you are the way you are. There's obviously a bunch of unconscious processing going on. And the end result of that processing, is at times available to conscious awareness. So in different states, in different contexts, different aspects of that processing may reach into awareness, right? But there's no thing like unconscious mind in there. Now, none of this changes the fact that we human beings are usually oblivious to why we act the way we do. Like we make up narratives with our left hemisphere pretty much that often have a very limited access to what might be going on behind the scenes. And we lack self-insight. So for example, just the other day, there was this woman who claimed to have very little money, who wanted to work with me for anger issues, and I gave her a very low rate, so she could afford it. I went out of my way to pack her into a busy schedule before Christmas and organized a lot of stuff for her. And then the day she was supposed to show up on Skype, didn't show up. I called her. She didn't even remember my name. She hadn't downloaded Skype. She hadn't done any of her tasks. She hadn't done everything. So I told her, look, this is completely unacceptable. Like, this is not good enough if you want to work with me. And she went into this rant about how committed she was and how serious she was and how responsible she was. And I said, no, you're not. Your actions show the exact opposite. There's no correlation whatsoever between what you say you want and what you actually do. And then she talked about how responsible she was and how sorry she was. And I said, fine. If you want to work with me, I'm going to charge you for this particular session at my regular rates, because I'm not paying for it. And then she got kind of defensive, and I said, well, should I pay for it? I showed up on time. And I knew, I had a correct theory based upon dealing with this in the past, that the day after I got this, I no longer want to do any work with you. I feel offended, the way you treated me wasn't right. I felt small at the way you talked to me. No one's supposed to do that. Very predictable response. So what? How does this apply to change work? Well, instead of looking for root causes or looking for parts in the unconscious mind, to come out there like genius from a bottle, one of the things that you can do to influence your unconscious processing, for example, is that you can train yourself to meet your habitual experience in a different way. So Shinsen Young, the meditation teacher, who I really appreciate, he has an analogy where he says, look, if you can train yourself to meet your habitual experience with concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity, that's like taking one of these Alka-Seltzer tablets and dropping them down into the, trickling down into the water, so to speak, trickling down into the deeper mind and beginning to rewire the deeper mind, from a more deep level. That's one efficient application. Another great application, my results improved a lot when I stopped looking so much for strategies in the NLP way of looking for strategies, and I more went into the more Albert Ellis, REBT orientation of just looking for people's rules, their perceived needs and musts and shoulds and these cognitive errors. And I help people identify that in artistic ways. Here's where my NLP and hypnosis background came in, but in artistic ways. That was usually way more useful. And also to help people set very different intentions and to understand their experience differently. So one of the most fascinating and rewarding things for me in doing change work is being able to help people with chronic pain. I've been able to help a lot of people who have had chronic back pain, for example, for years, sometimes decades, who've been through surgeries, acupuncture, chiropractic, all sorts of stuff, to no avail. And by educating them, by helping them discover a very different framework for how their pain is generated, essentially educating them and helping them to see that their pain is not the result of structural abnormalities, but it is in fact generated by psychological processes in the brain, people are more often than not able to rid themselves of the pain, actually turn it off. But of course, we never have any direct access to the processes that generate the pain or that turn the pain off and generates a different response. So if you want to read more about this, there's a couple of books I highly recommend. One is called Mindware by Richard Nisbett, and the other one is called Strangers to Ourselves, The Adaptive Unconscious by Timothy Wilson. Two of my top favorite psychology books. Anyways, I hope this little rant here was useful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them where you find the video. If you're looking for change work, mentoring, seminars, you can get in touch with me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.